Hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, coming to you on a Wednesday morning. Today I want to talk about sin and the Enneagram, particularly how the Enneagram explains the origin of sin. So we're going to go esoteric, but I hope this will be interesting. And it's certainly a way of drawing the Enneagram that you probably haven't seen before. If you watched my previous video, you saw a more traditional rendering of the Enneagram where we talk about the thinking triad, the feeling triad, and the doing triad. This is going to be a completely different approach to the Enneagram here that's more grounded in the origin of sin. So we better ground ourselves in what we mean by sin before we go any further. And here I'd like to reference Adyashanti, who has a book called Healing the Core Wound of Unworthiness. And in it, I think he makes a useful distinction between Eastern and Western approaches to sin. As I describe this, I don't want to defend any kind of actual geographic claims about the East and the West, although there might be some there. That's not my project, so I mean East and West in more sort of abstract terms. You can think of this as a spectrum of how we relate to sin, and a Westerner can certainly be anywhere on that spectrum, as can someone from the East. But this is what Adyashanti says, and I think it's compelling. The Eastern approach to sin is a lighter approach. It's one that basically takes the origin of sin as a kind of cosmic joke or forgetting, or potentially even a game in which this sort of awake awareness, this original deity or creator or Buddha is, to its own surprise, separated from itself. And so there's kind of a forgetting that happens there. And then the project is simply one of remembering one's own true nature. And you can see this show up also with the Greek tradition of the river Lethe, in which the dying cross, and when they cross it, they forget, they fall into oblivion, and their previous life is forgotten. So sort of forgetting there is the focus. Forgetting and remembering is the focus for the Eastern approach. The Western approach, in contrast, is more focused on a separation that has a wound associated with it. So, of course, Adam and Eve is the root text here for this tradition, but we see it played out in our religious institutions and our culture. There's a feeling of brokenness to the human experience and a wish for healing and recovery that is more rooted in psychology, is more rooted in potentially authority and judgment. And so it runs a little bit deeper, and there might be feelings of shame, guilt, terror. Those are more natural reactions to this feeling of basically having fallen out of favor with God. So Adyashanti's point in the essay, and he shares his own personal account, which is lovely, is that for many Westerners, it might be the case that the Eastern approach alone is insufficient for spiritual awakening. There may have to be some sort of reckoning with healing, spiritual healing, psycho-spiritual healing, that Eastern traditions may not naturally afford. So that's Adyashanti's distinction. It's certainly one that's, I'm sure, made elsewhere. It's kind of intuitive, and I think it's interesting. So where does the Enneagram sit in this account? It turns out that the Enneagram actually has quite a lot to say about the origin of sin, although this is sort of the more mystical, esoteric side of the Enneagram that you're not going to see in popular resources as much. But this comes from Claudio Naranjo, and presumably before him, Ichazo, Gurdjieff, his own sources. And as is the trademark of the Enneagram, it does seem to bridge East and West. And so remember, the Enneagram itself has its roots in this kind of cross-cultural mission. So we know that the Desert Fathers developed the Enneagram when they were working on their missions with Egyptian tribes, non-Christian tribes, trying to get them to convert. And so the Enneagram came out of these two different cultures meeting and trying to have a shared language for describing spiritual matters. So it's not that surprising that the Enneagram is sort of well set up to do some bridging of the East and the West. So let's see how it does that. And I'm going to quote here from Naranjo this is from Character and Neurosis. So I'll read this briefly and then we'll draw it out because that'll get clearer. He says, quote, "Inspection of the Enneagram of the Passions shows that 3 of them, at points 9, 6, and 3, occupy a position more central than the others. Because of the symbolism of the Enneagram, according to which the different points along it correspond to degrees and intervals in the musical scale, psychospiritual laziness at the top stands as the most basic of all, being, as it were, the do of the passions, as in do, re, mi." So let's pause there. So what Naranjo is saying is that, and he calls it there laziness, and that's the passion of the 9. But we could also sort of say forgetting or numbing. But I'll just stick with forgetting for now. These are all synonyms. That's sort of the first note of the Enneagram. It's the first note of human fallenness. And so that's very consistent with what we were just talking about with the Eastern approach, right? That the first thing that happens is from the perspective of kind of a non-dual awareness, there is some forgetting. But it doesn't stop there. So what does Naranjo say? He says, "The interconnections shown between these 3 core points in the form of sides of the triangle constitute what we may call psychodynamic connections, so that each may be said to underlie the next in a sequence mapped by arrows between them in a counterclockwise direction. If we read the psychodynamic sequence starting at the top, we may say that a lack of the sense of being, implicit in the psychological inertia or robotization of sloth, deprives the individual of a basis from which to act, and thus leads to fear." So let's draw that. So here's the 6, maybe a little bit lower there. Fear. So what happens? You in forgetting your true nature, I'll use kind of Eastern language for a second, then it may then arrive to you that you see a kind of groundlessness to experience, a lack of basis from which to act, In the same way that if you see something just completely alien to yourself, you don't know what to do. And so this contact with groundlessness initiates fear. This thing that I don't recognize is scary. It's scary. It's almost before threat. I think it's just scary because of it's unfamiliar. In the same way that we can be surprised, right? I mean, when we're surprised, it's hard to say if that can be attributed all the way back to threat, or if surprise is in a way more primordial than threat. In any case, we go from 9 to 6. We go from forgetting to fear. And it goes in this direction. What happens next? Naranjo says, since we must act in the world, however, as much as we may fear it, we feel prompted to solve this contradiction by acting from a false self rather than courageously being who we are. We build then a mask between ourselves and the world, and with this mask, we identify. And so that brings us to 3. And so what do we call this? There's forgetting, there's fear. So a few things are happening, right? From this story, there's a cover-up that's happening. So there's an obscuration that's happening. There's a falsity that's happening. So let's just say, I'm going to say falsity just for now. It doesn't really matter what these words are. We're just trying to get the feel of this dynamic that Naranjo is creating for us. But I'll just add cover up so we can kind of get the gist of it. And we'll go deeper in a second. So I come into contact with something completely surprising for which I have no basis on which to act. That triggers fear, but I have to act. And so I invent a solution. I make something up. What I make up is a false other and simultaneously a false self, and attribute I attribute things to that false self and false other. But in order for that to actually work, Naranjo concludes, to the extent that while we do this, we forget who we truly are, however, we perpetuate the ontic obscuration. That, in turn, supports fear and so on, keeping us in the vicious circle. So in other words, the cover-up doesn't work unless I cover it up even to myself. And to do that, I have to forget my true nature, or further forget my true nature. Just as like when we're surprised in the mirror, we don't perpetuate a vicious circle. We say, oh, and then we remember and recognize, oh, that's me. That's my reflection in the mirror. In this case, rather than a correction, there's a further obscuration. And so the cycle is continued. There's more forgetting, which leads to more groundlessness, fear, which leads to more falsity and covering up. So that's the account in the Enneagram. And so what's interesting about this is it provides a dynamic system that contains both the Eastern and the Western tradition. I want to say a little bit more about at least Buddhism here, which is the only Eastern tradition that I'm at all prepared to speak about, because I think this also clarifies quite wonderfully the dual meaning of ignorance in the East. So there's sort of small ignorance and big ignorance. The small ignorance is the forgetting that happens in a moment. It's that kind of divine mistake. That's a small kind of confusion. It's a mistake, a confusion, a numbness, a blindness, etc. But ignorance in its most powerful sense is willful. It's what Buddhism means when it talks about samsara. It's the whole world that's propagated or instantiated by efforts to perpetuate the obscuration. So really, ignorance isn't to be seen as like 0.9 on this, although 0.9 is sort of the starting place from the Eastern tradition. This is where East starts. But ignorance is this dynamic system, is this continuity of forgetting, leading to groundless experience. And then rather than awakening to groundlessness, we try to fix groundlessness through falsity and obscuration. For us to kind of pull off that heist, we have to further blind ourselves. And what we do over time is we develop this massive, almost sort of like evidence base that we're just so sure is real and it's very solid, but it's completely groundlessness. It's just a huge knot kind of built up from this circle repeating. That's ignorance. That's samsara. So that's the Eastern story. Let's talk about the West. So I'm not going to do a deep dive in this talk about Adam and Eve, but I think one would be well rewarded for doing that, because what's interesting about Adam and Eve is you do actually see them go through this cycle a few times. So while I think the West ultimately does sort of have its home base in point 3, which is this falsity, and of course that's the shame triad. So shame, this kind of fallenness, that all feels like 3 energy. But where exactly do Adam and Eve go wrong? It's not so easy to tell. So just paraphrasing here, right? The serpent comes to Eve and says, why don't you take a bite of that fruit? And Eve already isn't quite able to repeat God's instructions verbatim, which is sort of interesting. She says, that tree in the middle of the garden, I'm not supposed to eat. So there is a little bit of forgetting there. There's also sort of the numbness of Adam. Like Adam is right there while the serpent is convincing Eve. What is he doing? He in a way, he's asleep to the situation. So you could point to forgetting there. Then, of course, they eat and their eyes are opened. And when we talk about your eyes being opened, there is sort of this quality, this open-eyed quality to groundlessness, this fear. In that moment, there is sort of like this seeing things just as they are, that seeing the groundless quality. But what happens so fast is rather than seeing the actual groundlessness, we see the threat or the fear of that groundlessness, and move. And so Adam and Eve do experience fear, and then they quickly move to covering up and obscuration, both literally hiding from God, as well as then covering themselves up in fig leaves. And then there's further cover-ups, right? It's such a kind of a sad story because it's just one thing after another. God says, "Where are you?" They don't respond. So there's also sort of interesting forgetting on God's side. Like there's an interesting question of what God's experience is in that moment. Does he really not know where they are? And what is he feeling? You could play with that other side of things as well. In any case, I think the Western account reinforces this dynamic loop while finding its home base more in the shame triad. The predominant feeling one feels after reading Genesis is shame because of the many ways that Adam and Eve betrayed God and each other. Adam, of course, blaming Eve, right? She said I should eat it, right? Like it's a train wreck of humanity. So this is the way that I see them as bridged, and the Enneagram, I think, ultimately has this additional value that I think you probably can find in the East and you probably can find in the West, but isn't necessarily predominant in either, which is the Enneagram is really practical. As human beings, we end up finding our own home base somewhere either in the forgetting node of this system, in which case we're ultimately kind of cut off in our gut. We are not connected, or we've somehow sort of become slightly roboticized or numb to our true self. And that's the gut triad or the anger triad. Or our home base is somewhere in the fear of groundlessness. And so we experience kind of a continual panic or anxiety and experience the world as threat to some extent. And that's the thinking triad or the fear triad. And, that's the head. But again, when we're talking about heart, head, gut, it's energy qualities. It's not like literally you're not going to find it in neurons. Or in the heart triad, this falsity, shame, image triad. These are other words for this triad. This feeling of like just profound loneliness that at the same time is never remedied by our efforts to build up our image, right? We're fundamentally confused and self-deceiving about the me that there's like the me that wants to get watered, and then there's this beautiful plant flower that we're constructing, and so that thing keeps getting watered, and we're confused and hurt and ashamed about that. So that's a really alternate way to start to construct the Enneagram, and I won't go into it here, but if you think about this as sort of a laser beam, if it starts to go a few degrees off, that's when you get the other numbers. And Naranjo actually has a similar way of constructing those other numbers. That is, as far as I know, that's the origin of the stretch and release points that are surprisingly still talked about in a lot of professional resources. I would tread carefully about talking about stretch and release points. I'll do a video about it at some point. But I think the way at least Naranjo is referring to them, I don't think it's safe to really talk about moving to one in integration, moving to another in disintegration. That's one of the ways that they can move, but it's certainly not the only way. But I'll save that for another video post. I just want to build, basically, this is the scaffolding for the core numbers in the Enneagram through this perspective of original sin. Anything else to share here? Again, I've used Eastern and Western really casually, so I mean nothing, anthropological or cultural by them. I don't have any kind of expertise there, but I do think that using those is helpful. And I would say, I guess one last thing is, this is one of my favorite things that the Enneagram has to offer, is this diversity of human experience, that we can find a home in any of these. And that's where the 8 evil thoughts, or later 7 deadly sins, seem to originate from. Is actually kind of a handy way of helping somebody discover their home base, their passion, their addiction, their default way of sinning, and give them kind of, if we want to use tech language, right, a personalized trailhead for healing in that category. And Sufis, I think, have something similar. I know there's talk from the Gurdjieff tradition of like, what kind of idiot are you? And there are 9 idiots, which is sort of maybe a more playful way to talk about sin. And then the Eastern tradition I know less about, but whether it's the doshas in the Ayurvedic tradition, or the elements, or the realms, there's certainly plenty of material to work with for that. But that kind of personalization makes sense, that it's a little bit more regionalized and local. Like, you want, when you're doing your kind of debugging of your own personal ego structure, it makes sense to use language that's going to be familiar to you. So I don't really know if that's an Eastern or a Western tradition, but it's certainly core to the Enneagram. So that'll do it. I hope you enjoyed this dose of Enneagram wisdom, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.